In the spring of 1945, the Ministry of Information in London was instructed to make a film for Allied command, documenting the Nazi atrocities being discovered as Europe was liberated. Producer Sidney Bernstein recruited a brilliant team to work on the production, including the editors Stuart McAllister and Peter Tanner, and writers Colin Wills and Richard Crossman. The film was crafted from footage taken by British, American and Soviet military cameramen. Shocked and angered, they used their cameras to condemn the perpetrators, filming the victims of atrocities in close detail and producing a comprehensive record of the suffering of survivors. The footage was first screened in London at the Ministry of Information and was seen as damning proof of the criminality of the Nazi regime. When completed, the film was to be shown in German cinemas and to German prisoners of war. Its purpose was to counter any lingering support for the Nazis and to make people aware of their shared responsibility for the crimes committed in their name. Sidney Bernstein hoped to create a lasting and irrefutable record, to challenge any attempts to deny what had taken place. But events in Germany moved more quickly than the filmmaking process. The Allied government policy evolved from retribution to reconstruction. Armed resistance to the occupation was limited, and many Germans and POWs had been taken to sites of atrocity or seen photographs and short films of the horrors. Consequently, the film had missed its moment and was shelved. In 1952, the unfinished film was deposited at the Imperial War Museum. It had no titles, only brief sequences of synchronous sound, and the last reel had not been assembled. But there was a script for the commentary and a list of shots for each reel. Using the shooting script and the editor's notes, IWM's team has set about meticulously restoring and completing the film to the filmmaker's specifications. This has involved cleaning and grading each frame of the film, recording the commentary using the original script from 1945, and assembling the sixth and final reel for the first time. This film is an important historical document, and it has been restored, not revised or updated. Authenticity is integral to this process. It is the obligation of curators and archivists to preserve the artifacts and documents entrusted to them without making alterations which would change their original meaning or form. As a result, some of the facts are incorrect, and aspects of the commentary now sit uneasily with our understanding of the concentration camps. This film is not about the Holocaust or the persecution of any single group. Jews are only cited as one among many peoples, religions and nationalities who were victims of the Nazi terror. Despite these inaccuracies, inevitable for a documentary made so soon after the atrocities were discovered, this is a considered, sophisticated and non-sensational film. Viewers are warned that the film is very uncomfortable to watch. That was its intention, and there is no attempt to shy away from the subject matter. The camera stares at the most appalling scenes, made even more immediate by the restoration.
In March 1933, 17,264,296 Germans voted for the National Socialist Party. 20,680,000 others cast their vote for Democrats, Communists, Christian Socialists, People's Party, etc., etc. Lack of unity among these parties opposing the Nazis proved fatal. The National Socialist Party was in power. They made many claims and many promises.
Das deutsche Volk ist glücklich in dem Bewusstsein, dass die ewige Flucht der Erscheinungen nunmehr endgültig abgelöst wurde von einem ruhenden Pol.
The German people had embarked on that long, incredible journey that led seemingly out of chaos to unprecedented triumph. Promise after promise had been fulfilled. Austria and Czechoslovakia, 1938. Poland, 1939. Norway, Denmark, and France in quick succession. A place in the sun at last. True, they'd lost their trade unions and a lot of books had been burned, but it seemed a good sort of bargain, and one got to like being told what to do, having one's views prescribed, especially if it meant a vista bright with the promise of grandeur and conquest. The dead have been buried. It remains for us to care for these, the living. It remains for us to hope that Germans may help to mend what they have broken and cleanse what they have befouled. thousands of German people were made to see for themselves. To bury the dead, to file past.
My first reaction, I think, was very similar to what most people's first reaction will be to the film, which is that I was very upset by it, I was very shocked by it.
The story is incredibly emotional and devastating, but for me, I kind of protected myself from that really by just looking at what they did as filmmakers.
I think it is very difficult to stay watching the whole 75 minutes of the film all the way through. I think you almost have to give yourself a break and just close your eyes. It is unremitting.
It really changes your view of life completely when you see it.
And I think it's all right to allow people the freedom to leave if they can't tolerate those images. Nobody should feel that they have to be subjected to this. And I think it's important that people do get in touch with their feelings and their natural human responses to these images.
And dealing with that emotion, I would certainly suggest that you're speaking to friends and colleagues and family, and that you're trying to put it into some sort of historical narrative and understanding, so that you don't just see this film in isolation.
It may have a numbing effect, but in a way, by the repetition of these horrid images, people just must realize that actually it was like that, and you can't escape from it, and you shouldn't escape from it. My name is Peter Lentos, and my connection with Bergen-Belsen, then actually I was an inmate there. I was prisoner 8,242. Originally, Belsen was planned for, I think, 6,000 people. In the end, there were 10 times more. And during the last few days, there was no food, there was no water, and epidemic started on a very large scale, particularly typhus, but also dysentery, TB, and starvation. As a child of 5, I mean, the most momentous events or impressions were those of physical hardship. The hunger, the extreme cold, standing for counting for hours in the wind in December, January, February, the lice, the lack of food, and later on, the increasing number of corpses, of whom or of which my father became unfortunately one.
Belsen was the first camp that was liberated by the British, where the prisoners were still inside the camp. And therefore, the dimension that was found was so unimaginable that, yes, the decision was taken, this needs to be documented. It needs to be documented in order to use this as evidence that these crimes have actually happened.
I think the original filmmakers were really trying to make almost a forensic case. They had arrived on the scene and discovered these horrors, and I think they really wanted to make almost a criminal lawyer's case, some absolutely incontrovertible evidence.
I think my father's purest intention in making this film was to create evidence for all mankind, and he stated that himself, and it's actually written in the script.
Bernstein wanted to make a film that could not be dismissed as atrocity propaganda, as Allied propaganda, that would show Germans what the Third Reich had done to Jews and the other peoples of conquered Europe in their name.
It was a very brave and legitimate attempt to produce something that would stand as a testament to the events and also as a sort of guard against future denials.
The project grew and grew, and as it grew, the political context in which it was being made changed.
And already in the summer of 1945, not only were the cinemas not yet open, so it would have been difficult to show the films anyway, but the local military commanders were noticing that the German population was getting tired of being told repeatedly, this is your fault, you are guilty of this.
It was no longer required because the anticipated terrorist guerrilla movement by people still loyal to the Nazis never transpired. And more to the point, the people who are running the British zone of Germany, which is after all the most devastated part of Germany, the British Allied government on the ground, need the Germans to help them rebuild Germany. And you can't keep beating the Germans around the head with their guilt if you want to bring them on side.
So I think the film missed its moment. I don't think there was a conspiracy to stop the film. I think the decision was made to make a shorter film available that they could get out more quickly.
Well, the extraordinary thing about the silencing of this film was that it also silenced my father for 40 years. And he said that it was the greatest regret of his life that he had not finished that film.
IWM's aim in finishing this film and putting the reels together as they were originally intended was to bring together this piece of historical evidence so that we could present it to a wider audience, but also so that, in a sense, the project itself could be completed, it could be finished.
If you want to keep the spirit of a historical document, you have to follow the narrative that this historical document had. And luckily, this was still available. There was a script for the sixth reel. So all you had to do, it sounds very easy, but of course it wasn't, all you had to do was to fulfill what the original filmmakers had intended.
We decided to go back to the original rushes, go back to the original negatives and the masters, scan them digitally, and then build the whole film up again. So we remade the film.
The only creative liberties we've taken, in fact, have been to add a few sound effects. But we've resisted the temptation to embellish it in any way.
We didn't add colour. We didn't add any other elements that wouldn't have been available to a filmmaker working in 1945.
I admire the integrity of the team at the Imperial War Museum, who've decided, as I understand it, to stay as closely as they could to exactly what we imagine my father and his team would have wanted the film to say then.
While it's important that as a museum that we don't tamper with historical evidence, of course that does present problems for a modern audience. So some of the details about numbers, about camps and locations, also the fact that the film doesn't specifically mention Jewish victims.
I think that my father, in his role at the end of the war and in filmmaking, was walking a very fine line as a Jew working on film, on propaganda, being faced with this particular subject matter and trying to figure out the best way to tell this story for German audiences in a way that would get their attention without playing into what he imagined or was innate anti-Semitism there.
So Richard Crossman and Sidney Bernstein knew that back home in Britain, there was not a great deal of sympathy for the Jews. People were not overflowing with affection for the Jews. There was anti-Semitism at home. And they feared that if they stressed Jewish suffering in Bergen-Belsen, stressed that the Jews had been the specific particular victims of the Third Reich, no one would pay attention because they would say, well, they had it coming to them, they're Jews after all.
I think that those who wrote the script, Colin Wills, Dick Crossman, would have been wanting to represent the concentration camp system as something that was affecting many races and religions.
So it was better to place Jewish suffering in the context of more wide-scale suffering, to refer to the Jews not as Jews, but as citizens of the countries from which they came, as French, as Poles, as Hungarians.
But of course, the Jews were particularly targeted, as we now know very well and understand very well. So yes, there is this strange feeling about it, but I think we should take Sidney Bernstein at face value that the human suffering, in a general sense, was what actually motivated him to make this film.
I think the question of the treatment of the dead, particularly the way they are handled by the SS guards, is a very difficult one, and it's part of the film that I myself have a lot of difficulty watching. I think there are several layers to this. I think that the immediate question of trying to clear the camp of the enormous number of dead bodies was just a major problem for the British in Belsen, and that they reacted in any way they could. I think there was also a very strong feeling that the SS should be punished.
Their callousness, their hardness, their brutality is so emblematic of the way they carry those bodies. I think it's another way of damning the SS.
The shower scene where the women are allowed to wash under hot water for the first time in who knows how long. To me, that's not prurient in any way, although I think some people might think it was. I think it's these women reclaiming their rights.
And the cameraman said, after 10 days of filming these scenes of horror, it was so good to move on to softer things and to celebrate the return of these people's sense of humanity, dignity, and community.
I think Bernstein's film is essential as a historical document because it shows us what a British filmmaker with considerable resources at his disposal could find out, could know in the late spring, the summer of 1945.
It's as if you're seeing what they saw in the cutting rooms. It's as if almost as if you're there behind the camera with those guys who took those amazing images.
I think what this film uniquely does is give an audience, a contemporary audience, a sense of the vastness of the subject matter and of the atrocity.
It gives actually the magnitude of what happened. The actual figures can be disputed, but there is no question that the film reflects the end stages of the final solution.
Many people speak about learning lessons from the Holocaust, but of course genocides still happen. So again, as a piece of evidence of genocide in the 20th century, it's incredibly important and relevant.
It's also a call to all of us to actually speak up and speak out when we see this happening again. And this today, in all honesty, is more important than ever. That, for me, is the biggest value of this film.
The film obviously tells us that human beings are capable of enormous inhumanity to each other, but it also tells us that human beings are capable of enormous powers of survival.
And I think we have a responsibility to those who died to refresh our memories and to increase understanding of what actually happened.
I always thought that if I survived Belsen, I am going to survive whatever happens, everything else. So in a way, it was, to some extent, a source of strength for future life.
I often say that what we've done is to polish up a prayer. Bernstein, Crossman, and Colin Wills wrote a prayer for humanity, and I think that's what we've done, or I hope that's what we've done. We've polished up their prayer.